The heavy iron door creaked open, revealing an environment that looked radically different from the previous 2 rooms. Instead of the rather sterile spaces filled with little more than empty ground, this one was dense with trees and scattered boulders. Some of the rocks even contained hollow openings large enough to hide inside. This had been the hardest room to create, and the illusion magic had continued shaping it while Roland presented the previous 2 rooms to the other youths. Laren's weaknesses could not be addressed with a generic training environment. His greatest strength lay in using terrain to conceal himself and attack from hidden vantage points. However, he was equally poor at recognizing the right moment to strike. One of his biggest flaws was spending too much time searching for the perfect hiding place instead of anticipating where his teammates would move. He performed best when acting independently, shadowing the group from a distance before slipping into position and launching a surprise attack when the enemy's attention was elsewhere. To address this, Roland had prepared a scenario filled with countless hiding places and 2 teams of puppets. One team represented Laren's allies, whom he needed to support and protect, while the other consisted of aggressive melee and caster constructs that represented the opposing force. Your objective here is to make every battle easier for your team. Roland began explaining as he pointed toward the 4 golem puppets representing Laren's teammates. To make them easier to distinguish, each had a different shape and size that loosely matched the members of his actual team. Creating training scenarios of this complexity while controlling so many golems was quite an achievement, but they were still only Tier 1 and Tier 2 creations, making them relatively inexpensive. First and foremost, you must learn to choose your targets wisely. You might think focusing on the most powerful mage or the greatest threat is always the right decision, but that will not always be the case. I understand. Laren nodded confidently, as though he already knew the lesson. His previous performance, however, had shown that he did not. You do? We shall see. Roland had intended to explain the exercise in greater detail, but the young man seemed far too certain of himself. Target priority was important, but it was not everything. The opposing side could disguise its true intentions or even bait attackers into carefully prepared traps. Laren would have to face several different scenarios Roland had designed, and hopefully each one would chip away at that overconfidence. If you wish to begin, press the button on that tree. If even one of your teammates becomes incapable of fighting, you lose. Now begin. He pointed toward a bright red button embedded in the trunk of a tree, conspicuously out of place within the otherwise natural surroundings. It served as the control to begin the trial and restart it after each failure. Judging by what Roland had seen so far, there would likely be quite a few of those. Once Laren pressed the button, Roland stepped outside and continued observing the exercise through the monitoring system. Just as expected, Laren immediately encountered his first obstacle. He spent too long searching for the ideal hiding spot. There were trees, bushes, trenches, and rocky hollows scattered throughout the field, each offering its own advantages. Yet while he hesitated, trying to find the perfect vantage point, the simulation had already begun. The allied team puppets began advancing down the central path, and almost immediately, the enemy forces sprang an ambush. A massive, heavily armored vanguard puppet charged straight down the middle, drawing everyone's attention, while 2 smaller caster puppets began chanting from the flanks. Laren was slow to find the best angle, as he had been many times before, and when he finally reacted, he chose the wrong target. Just as he was sneaking around to attack from behind, an enemy puppet with a role similar to his was doing the same. While Laren targeted one of the caster puppets, his counterpart struck at their greatest weakness, the Lucienne puppet. Once it was taken down, the enemy did not press the attack. They simply retreated because with their main tracker eliminated, there was no longer any treasure hunt to win. Bzzz. A strange sound filled the training chamber after the puppet collapsed. Just as Roland had explained, the simulation came to an immediate halt as soon as a single allied puppet was destroyed. Laren stared at the frozen constructs, seemingly confused as to why everything had ended when he still had plenty of time left. Sometimes it was better to let these headstrong mages figure things out on their own instead of handing them the answer from the beginning. Still, if they failed to improve quickly enough, he might have to intervene. Now then, Lucienne Arden, you are next. Follow me. Out of the entire group, his sister was still the weakest link. The others did not require much guidance, nor did they need to learn any new skills or get better at them. Lucienne, however, was different. She had obtained the clairvoyant class, one that was entirely new. She needed time to grow accustomed to its unique skills and spells. Of course, Deputy Professor. In settings like this, Lucienne had to behave as though she did not know him personally. The monitoring system could be accessed by other people, and if they ever revealed their true relationship, the secret would be out before long. Your problem lies in using your skills effectively alongside your team. You are not just the one who finds the treasure. You can do far more to support your allies. Tell me, what do you think is the most valuable resource on the battlefield? Magical power? Numbers. He led her into a smaller chamber, one similar to the area Laren had used, though much more compact. Trees, boulders, and shallow pits filled the space, but there were also far more distractions. Birds sang overhead, water flowed somewhere in the distance, and random gusts of wind rustled the leaves. It's information. If you always know where your enemies are, they can never ambush you, and you can easily avoid any traps they try to set. Lucienne listened intently, her eyes darting across the hyper-realistic forest. The rustling leaves and distant rushing water felt remarkably real, but she knew the entire environment was an illusion. Information. She repeated the word softly, as though searching for its deeper meaning. I think I understand, Professor. Good. Your task is simple. Find the hidden enemies within the forest while ignoring the unnecessary sounds and visual distractions. Several specialized camouflage puppets are concealed throughout this area. They will not attack you, but they will constantly shift positions to avoid detection. Your objective is to locate every hidden one before any of them reveal themselves. Lucienne nodded, her expression turning serious. She closed her eyes and focused her mana. The clairvoyant class was tailor-made for finding the positions of others. It was far more precise than any other tracking class, and if she truly mastered it and raised her skill level, there would be no one at Tier 1 capable of hiding from her. Her range is limited for now, but once she gains more levels and starts using the mana-boosting equipment, she should be comparable to a Tier 2 tracking mage. Roland thought to himself as he left the training chamber where he had been alone with his sister. You can do it, Lucienne. The fifth member of the group was also waiting, though her training would be quite different from everyone else's. I am ready, Professor. What do you want me to do? Where is my private training chamber? I didn't see another door. Oh, could that be part of the test? Do I have to find the door first? The girl was as chatty as ever, but she would probably be disappointed once she learned what he actually had planned for her. No, you won't need a personal training room. Here, you'll be studying this instead. Selpha looked up at Roland as he activated one of his spatial runes and pulled out a thick book before placing it into her hands. The moment he let go, she nearly toppled over under its weight. A magic tome. Selpha blinked, her large hat tilting precariously to one side as she struggled to keep her balance beneath the heavy book. Something like that. It contains various spells that might prove useful and will probably surprise your opponents. Spells? The girl was clearly surprised by this turn of events. She already knew more spells than anyone else in the group. When it came to magical knowledge and applying spells effectively, she was by far the most accomplished caster among them. However, these spells were different. Professor, these spell formulae. You want me to cast these? But... She managed to open the first page while trying not to lose her balance. After pushing her hat back into place, she noticed something unusual. The spells were unlike anything she had seen before. Indeed. I want you to learn these. There isn't much else you need to improve when it comes to teamwork or your role within the group. But Professor, I don't think I'll be able to use these. Is that so? Are you worried about the amount of mana they require? She nodded as she closed the tome. It was a reasonable concern. The spells inside were modified Tier 1 spells that incorporated Tier 2 principles. They were significantly stronger than ordinary Tier 1 spells, but as a Tier 1 class holder, her mana pool was quite limited. What she did not know was how much freedom she would gain once she began using the support equipment. Yes, Professor. Don't worry about your mana. That problem will be easy to solve. For now, just learn the theory behind these spells. Once you're familiar with them, report to the runic department. Sure, Professor. Selpha still looked unconvinced, but she was also fascinated by the intricate magical theory spread across the pages. Her eyes widened as she grasped the complexity of the modifications. They were completely unlike the standard academic curriculum taught at the institute. This is quite complex. It is, but someone like you should be able to do it. Roland replied, knowing that this girl was a maniac when it came to acquiring new knowledge. She was already ahead of the others, so this was the only thing she needed to focus on to make her utility spells more powerful. You may leave now. I will give you a week's time to memorize as much as you can. Only a week. She flinched at the time frame, but they were running dangerously short on time, and their group was performing poorly during the life training exercises. Not enough? He asked, but she shook her head while looking toward the door Lucienne had gone through earlier. No. I'll try, leave it to me, Professor. He nodded at her response and allowed her to leave the training chamber. The others are doing poorly now, but they should improve. Now that he had assigned everyone their tasks, he glanced toward the training chambers where the students were hard at work. Oxian was already on his fourth attempt with little progress to show for it. Elian lay on the ground, twitching after being paralyzed, while Laren was already pressing the red button again to restart after another failure. Roland sighed quietly inside his helmet, realizing that breaking their bad habits would probably take time and consume a great deal of materials in the process. Well, Rome wasn't built in a day. He pushed the thought aside and removed himself from the situation. The other members of the runic department had already been briefed on the purpose of the trials, but that did not mean he was free to leave just yet. Professor Wayland, how did you come up with such innovative ways of using those puppets and the illusory chamber? This has to be added to the institute curriculum. I just did. Once he returned to the control room where Arian and the others were waiting, he was greeted with applause from every assistant teacher and professor present. Stephen was there as well, and for some reason, his glasses were completely fogged up, as though he had been panting for quite some time. You hear that, everyone? He just did. Oh, Professor Wayland. Arian chuckled, clearly unconvinced by his explanation. Roland was hardly about to admit that he had drawn upon knowledge from his old world along with everything he had learned in this one. However, the 5 students he had helped were not the only ones who needed guidance. Now that he had demonstrated what could be accomplished with the illusory chambers, even more work was piled onto his shoulders. Over the next few days, he spent his time traveling back and forth between the institute and the teleportation chamber. He was tasked with developing helpful training programs for other students, including those who had already reached Tier 2, which only made the work more challenging. The week passed in a blur as he juggled his responsibilities at the institute with his work back home. Every other day, he had to venture into the dungeon with Agni to level up. During the days in between, he either worked on the mobile runic armor or returned to the institute, where everyone seemed to be asking for his opinion on nearly every aspect of the upcoming competition. Roland stood before the main observation console. He had been keeping up with their progress and was pleasantly surprised when he returned 2 days later to check on them. Things looked very different now. Oxian finally seemed to understand the core principle of his role. On the screen, the large youth was no longer charging ahead blindly. Instead, he positioned himself like a solid wall in front of the fragile puppet constructs. When a combat puppet lunged forward, Oxian simply deflected the blow with a controlled bash of his rocky fist. He had even begun incorporating other defensive spells, raising shields of earth around himself and creating earthen barriers that protected the group from attacks coming from the front. He let his rocky armor absorb the impacts without abandoning the group. From time to time, however, he still made a few blunders, allowing enemies to slip through the defensive perimeter he was trying to maintain. His gaze then shifted to the other young man, Laren, who was currently crouching motionless inside a hollow tree trunk. Previously, Laren had only used these hiding spots to launch quick attacks or avoid combat, but this time he was using them defensively. This particular hiding place was close to his team, and instead of targeting the puppets attacking them directly, he waited for one that tried to sneak around their position. The moment it revealed itself, he leaped from the tree, cast a binding spell to halt its advance, and then worked together with the puppet constructs to destroy it. These two are getting there, but while Oxian and Laren had made big strides, the same could not be said for Elian. His form had improved slightly, but he still struggled to predict where attacks were coming from and to concentrate on casting his spells under pressure. His progress remained slow, and perhaps Roland would need to find a better way to help him overcome his fear. Then there was Lucienne, who had neither surged ahead nor fallen behind. Her progress was steady and roughly where Roland had expected it to be. Her skills still needed considerable improvement, but with the help of the mana recovery devices and continued practice, he knew she could make even greater progress. I'll need to introduce this sooner rather than later. While he had originally planned to wait another month before handing out the new devices, the problems these students were facing called for an extra push. He wanted them to develop at their own pace to some extent, but time was beginning to run short. Selphie had also grasped the concepts behind the spells he had rewritten. However, he had underestimated her eagerness to cast them. She had pushed herself so hard that she nearly suffered a mana backlash and upset her stomach by drinking too many mana potions in an attempt to keep casting. I suppose this is also an opportunity for me to learn. Roland almost chuckled to himself as he walked away from the control room. He was not a teacher and knew little about explaining concepts or guiding young minds. Although he had recently taken on his own disciple, he was discovering just how difficult it was to teach others when every mind worked differently. He made his way through the corridors toward the training area. The time had come to give the youths the customized items he had been preparing and teach them how to handle their newfound power responsibly. Fire bolt. A bolt of fire shot forward and collided with a set of wooden targets at the end of the chamber. The moment the blazing projectile struck, the wood splintered in every direction. The explosion was far larger than a standard Tier 1 spell should have produced, and the flames even reached the two targets on either side. Yes, I did it. Ack. Elian smiled as he watched the targets shatter, but his moment of triumph was short-lived. He had finally managed to cast the spell successfully and dodge the first attack coming his way, only to be struck by another that followed immediately after. Even if you manage to hit your target, Elian, you still have to watch out for any secondary threats that might follow immediately after. Roland entered the room to find Elian sprawled across the ground. Although his progress had been slow, he was getting better at keeping his composure. Every now and then, he managed to complete his spell and hit his target, but more often than not, something still went wrong. There will be students from other magical academies waiting for you to let your guard down. Never relax unless you are absolutely certain there is no one around you. Why yes, Deputy Professor. Elian replied as he rubbed the back of his head. Even though a paralyzing bolt had struck him, he seemed to have grown accustomed to the sensation, making Roland wonder if he should increase its strength. But what brings you here, could it be? Is this training over now? His eyes widened as though salvation itself had appeared. He had spent half of every day for the past week enduring this exercise, and it was obvious he wanted nothing more than for it to end. However, Roland had not come to dismiss them. Instead, he intended to add another layer to their training. Not quite. Come with me for now. Ah! The young man's shoulders slumped in disappointment. Roland turned and walked into the main chamber, with Elian following close behind. The other students had already gathered there, with Selphie hurrying in from outside and nearly tripping over her own feet. My apologies, Deputy Professor. She stumbled to a stop just before Lucienne. It was obvious she was not herself today. She looked exhausted, with dark bags beneath her eyes, the result of spending the past week cramming magical formulae into her head. You've all worked hard. Some of you have begun to grasp the essence of your new roles, while others still have a long way to go. Elian's expression fell, as though he believed those words had been directed at him. Lucienne lowered her head as well, but Roland knew they had all been putting in genuine effort, and that counted for more than talent alone. It's fine. Don't get discouraged if your progress has been slow. It's only been a week since you began learning these skills properly. He did not want to sound too harsh. Some of these young mages had probably never struggled this much before, especially after spending their lives being praised for their talent. Being confronted with their own shortcomings day after day could easily shatter their confidence if he pushed them too far. What matters is that every one of you has improved. However, the competition will not wait for you. To give you the edge you need, I have prepared something for each of you. Roland gestured toward a large table that looked completely out of place in the illusory chamber. Resting on top of it was a large rectangular crate covered with multiple locks and engraved with runes. As he approached, the runes flashed briefly, and the locks slowly disengaged. A mage hand spell lifted the lid, and the students leaned forward as curiosity got the better of them. What are these, Deputy Professor? Selphie's eyes sparkled as she looked inside the crate. Her hat, as always, slipped over her eyes, but she quickly pushed it back into place. As you already know, the runic department will be providing magical devices for your use during the convocation. These are prototypes that will help you manage your spells and mana far more efficiently than any enchanted equipment currently available. Roland continued as he removed the most important part of the devices first, the runic batteries. There were several ways to attach them to the body, and they were only slightly larger than a modern-day 9-volt battery. They shared the same rectangular shape but were about twice as long. Their metallic surface was covered in miniature runes. There were many shapes the batteries could have taken, but in the end he settled on a rectangular design instead of a cylindrical one. He had relied on other smiths to manufacture them, and producing a rectangular shape was much easier than machining a perfectly cylindrical one to fit a specific holster. Flat surfaces also made it easier to engrave runes without imperfections that would reduce the overall grade. Each of you will receive one battery along with a customized receptor device. The battery stores mana in advance, so your own reserves will no longer be the only source you can rely upon. Roland placed one of the rectangular batteries on the table before lifting what looked like a leather harness. There were several ways to carry the batteries, and he had brought a variety of harnesses, belts, and straps for the students to choose from. It was possible to place a battery inside a spatial rune that would power the enchantment from within. However, the amount of mana required meant the battery would have to be both quite large and made from Tier 3 materials to function properly. Such equipment was forbidden during the competition. Stores mana, this block does. Roland stepped aside as Selphie spoke. Yes, it does. Please choose whichever harness you prefer for carrying it. Pick one that best suits your fighting style and will not interfere with your casting or movement. These were still prototypes, and this group would be the first to test them. If it had been his choice alone, Roland would have recommended the belts. They were the least intrusive, could be easily concealed beneath robes or armor, and were comfortable to wear. However, everyone had their own preferences. Even the chest harness he had designed for Armand was among the options, and Oxian already seemed interested in it. After examining the contents of the crate, each student selected the option that suited them best. Oxian chose the chest harness, which could be easily hidden beneath his clothes while remaining protected by the rocky armor he formed around his body. Laren chose a slender thigh strap that could be securely fastened over his light trousers. As a scout who relied heavily on agile movement and silent maneuvering, he could not afford any extra bulk around his chest or waist. Elian chose a wide leather belt that rested comfortably around his waist, and Lucienne made the same choice. Selphie, on the other hand, opted for a combination of a belt and a shoulder strap with multiple battery slots positioned across the front, allowing her to replace them quickly. It was as if she expected to use a great deal of mana and knew that being able to swap batteries without delay would be essential. Once you have secured the harness, place the battery into the slot. Roland instructed, and the students followed his directions. You will not feel anything just yet. First, take these armbands. Each one has been fashioned to match your specific mana pattern and will only work for you. For the time being, you will be limited to the armbands, but they can later be crafted into other forms, including armor, if you wish. The students slipped the armbands over their wrists, watching curiously as the metal bands glowed with a faint, pulsing light. Roland observed them closely. Matching the devices to their individual mana signatures had been a straightforward process thanks to the all-purpose ESA scanners and his previous experience with his disciple. There was virtually no chance that any of them would reject their user, but another issue remained. The armbands, batteries, and even the runes had all been made from Tier 1 materials. Because of that, their lifespan was limited. They might need to be replaced after several hours of continuous use or sooner if they were subjected to an exceptionally prolonged exchange of spells. This was one of the things Roland intended to test today. Once he had gathered enough data, he would begin upgrading every component. Now then, channel a small amount of your mana into the armband to activate it. Some of the students hesitated at first. Testing an unfamiliar magical device always carried a degree of risk, but once Lucienne activated hers, the others quickly followed. Roland knew the sensation would feel strange at first. The armband forcefully redirected the user's mana, and every mage instinctively tried to resist and regain control. Once the flow stabilized, however, the equipment began functioning exactly as intended. Oh, this feels strange. Selphie said as she quickly chanted a simple light spell, producing a glowing orb above her fingertip. She stared at it for a moment and immediately realized it was much brighter than she had intended. Oh, I barely used any mana. The power output is stronger, and the casting speed has increased too. Lucienne cast a clairvoyance spell to detect the people around her, and her eyes widened in surprise. The mental feedback was far clearer than usual. It felt as though a veil had been lifted from her mind, allowing her to perceive everything with remarkable clarity. The range has increased, and casting feels so effortless. Oxian clenched his fists and activated his signature earthen skin spell. A rocky layer formed almost instantly, coating his arms with far less delay than usual. Even after his entire body became encased in sand and stone, the armband and batteries continued to function flawlessly. Laren simply used his stealth magic to blur his body before them. He activated and deactivated the spell several times, each attempt improving the speed of the casting while consuming very little mana, just as Roland had said. Even Elian was shocked when the fire bolt spell he cast was produced much faster and at half the mana cost of the original version. Each of the students looked at the armbands as though they were legendary treasures, but they soon turned to Roland with concern on their faces. "Deputy Professor, does this magical equipment have any drawbacks?" Selphie asked directly while creating a small light show above her head as she tested the limitations of the armband. "There are no drawbacks to using these runic devices. The only real downside is the batteries. They will need to be replaced after a certain amount of your mana has been used." The question gave him the perfect segue into the next device he had prepared. Roland knew the treasure hunt could last for quite some time, and that the students had limited space in the spatial bags they could carry, but there was a solution. "Take a look at this. It is called a runic battery charger. If your batteries run out of mana, you can recharge them manually by transferring your own mana into them. Use it whenever you have the time and your mana reserves are full." "Oh." Selphie's eyes widened again as Roland presented the charger. It was not much to look at, just another rectangular box crafted from polished dark steel. It featured several distinct slots along its upper surface where the batteries could be inserted. Roland demonstrated its use by placing an uncharged battery into one of the slots and channeling some of his own mana into the device. As soon as the process began, a red light appeared on the side to indicate that the battery was charging. This light will gradually change color. It will go from red to orange, then yellow, and finally green to indicate the battery's charge level. You can also use it to check how much charge your current batteries have left, although that will not be necessary forever. A feature like that will eventually be integrated into your armbands. With that, the presentation was over and the students were fully equipped. All that remained was for them to return to their personalized training chambers and practice with their new equipment. "Return to your training chambers and try out your new equipment." As soon as he gave the order, the 5 students hurried back to their respective simulation chambers. Only Selphie remained by the table, eager to experiment with a few more spells. Roland returned to the central observation room to watch their progress, and the improvement in their proficiency became obvious almost immediately. Elian, who had been falling behind the most, displayed a drastic change in demeanor. His spell casting was sharper, his chants were faster, and there was a reason for it. The enchantment on his armband maintained a constant clarity spell that eased the stress that had been weighing on him and making every task more difficult. Although it consumed some of the battery's charge, it was the boost he needed to finally keep his composure under pressure. This time around, he was able to dodge more of the random bolts fired at him, and casting fire bolt spells came much more naturally. He reached the point where his targets had to be replaced several times. Eventually, the difficulty could be increased, and the circle he stood in was made smaller, something he clearly did not appreciate. The others performed well too. Oxian moved much faster than before and could conjure larger stone walls to protect his puppets. Laren's concealment magic had grown stronger, and his offensive spells had improved as well. He sliced through the hidden puppets to support his team. Lucienne could now repeatedly cast her new spells and make better use of her skills to continue progressing. "Everything is working within the expected parameters." "It certainly seems that way, Professor Wayland," Arian commented as another round of applause filled the control room. The other teachers from the runic department had gathered to watch Roland explain the prototypes and present them alongside the students. "There is no need for that. We still need to gather more data on the prototypes before we can produce more for the other students. Leave it to us, Deputy Professor Wayland." Stephen saluted him for some reason, as though Roland were some kind of military commander, and the others in the room followed suit. Roland was not quite sure how to react, so he simply nodded. At least now he could devote more of his attention to other matters. Time continued to pass, but it felt well spent. At least for the next week, I should be able to leave them on their own and focus on other issues. Once everything was finished, he returned home, where more work awaited him. The upper section of the mobile runic armor had been assembled and was almost ready for its first live walking test. Then there was Agni, whose levels continued to rise steadily. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Work on the golem consumed nearly half of his time, while Agni's training took up another third. With help from the other members of the runic department, Roland was able to reduce his own involvement at the institute. His training methods were adopted by many of the other competition teams. Personalized training rooms were created for the remaining students, and improved versions of the runic battery equipment were introduced to give them time to adapt. Finally, with less than 3 months remaining before the competition began, Agni achieved the breakthrough. Oh woo! Oh! You finally leveled up! Good job! Roland stood in front of a runic monitor as Agni came padding back. By this stage of their training, he could even leave him alone to fight the creatures. Agni no longer needed Roland's help to earn the final level. Name: Sunlight Wolf Divine Form L250. Type: Fire/Earth/Divine Beast. It felt quite cathartic to reach such a high level. It was a monumental achievement that few people or monsters could accomplish on their own. Under normal circumstances, it would have taken many more years, but thanks to Roland's knack for finding the best grinding spots, he had achieved one of the fastest progressions possible. Well then, Agni, are you ready to change your form? Woof! There was not a hint of hesitation in the bark, and the wolf's tail wagged like a propeller. However, Roland was not about to transform his wolf inside an undead ruin deep within a dungeon. It would be much safer to return home and do it in a controlled environment. Good. Let's head home then. But first, let's take a look at the options. Woof. Woo. Woof. Okay, can you just stop jumping around? You're going to crack the floor. Roland said to Agni, who was bounding through one of the corridors leading to the reinforced testing chamber. They had just returned from the dungeon through the teleportation gate and were only moments away from reaching a much safer environment. The last time Agni had undergone an evolution had been quite some time ago, but the transformation had been extreme. The entire compound had been illuminated by the flames Agni produced, and his body had grown considerably larger. It had been a major structural and skeletal transformation that was quite volatile. Compared to humans gaining new classes, monsters experienced far more drastic changes. If Roland received another class, his body would remain the same, and he certainly would not unleash powerful surges of mana like his companion. Agni's last evolution had been quite the spectacle, so this time Roland had made sure it would take place inside a heavily reinforced, bunker-like chamber. I've heard that some evolutions can even cause powerful explosions and affect the surrounding environment. The massive door before them slowly slid open, its enormous weight making the movement heavy and sluggish. It was a reinforced vault plated with layers of specialized, high-grade alloy that Roland had personally treated to withstand intense heat and devastating kinetic impacts. Large runic inscriptions lined the walls, glowing with a faint blue light that showed the defensive barriers were fully charged and ready. He was not taking any chances and had already evacuated everyone from the compound. His wife was in the city running the school as its headmistress, the children staying in the dormitories were there as well, and everyone else, including Rastix, had been instructed to leave for the time being. There was no telling what a second legendary monster evolution might bring, and he had to make sure that any magical radiation remained contained within the facility. Under normal circumstances, and just like previously, it would have been wiser to perform the evolution outside, where the heat could dissipate instead of building up enough pressure to cause an explosion. However, with so many eyes on him and the compound, he needed to ensure that no energy escaped. The chamber had been equipped with safeguards designed to contain the magical discharge while safely venting the superheated air. How will the Solarian Church react to this evolution? Agni leaped into the center of the chamber, his paws clicking loudly against the dense metal floor. Despite the confined space, the massive wolf could barely contain his excitement. The air around him was already beginning to shimmer from the latent heat radiating from his fur as his anticipation continued to grow. Calm down, boy, or you're going to set off the defensive sensors before we even start. Roland ran a hand through the flaming mane in an attempt to calm the wolf. Once Agni settled down, he finally turned his attention to the choices he had been given. Wolf of Eclipse. Ice/Divine/Beast/. A legendary creature that represents the cold, silent majesty of the moon and the cosmic void. It possesses silver and midnight blue fur along with deep blue eyes. Its body is surrounded by crystalline armor that resembles frost, and a soft chilling aura surrounds it at all times. It is believed to be the legendary companion animal of the moon gods and the bringer of night. Blazing Alpha Volcanic Dire Wolf. Fire/Earth/Beast. A more evolved form of the Alpha Dire Ruby Wolf. Its body, which was previously transformed into a shell of volcanic matter, is now engulfed in a permanent blaze of crimson flames. This monster's body is rumored to be as hot as lava and burns perpetually. Its flesh is immune to all fire spells below Tier 3, and it is highly resistant to physical attacks. Blazing Alpha Mystical Dire Ruby Wolf. Fire/Earth/Beast. A more evolved form of the Alpha Mystical Dire Ruby Wolf. The rubies covering its body become sharper and more durable than before. Its intelligence also continues to increase, allowing it to learn even more spells than its less evolved counterpart. It possesses a more pronounced spiral horn on its forehead, and its body is perpetually engulfed in flames that radiate enough heat to affect its surroundings. Solar Wolf Ruby Form. Fire/Divine/Beast. A legendary creature that was once the companion animal of the Sun Goddess. Its radiant form blinds all that is unholy, and it embodies the divine radiance of the Holy Sun deity itself. This Solar Wolf variant still retains its ability to transform into a secondary form, one that resembles a lesser evolutionary stage with a large spiral horn protruding from its forehead. Mystical Ruby Fenrir. Fire/Earth/Beast. A rare ruby variant of the legendary Fenrir wolf. It combines the massive frame of a Fenrir with the magical aptitude of a blazing alpha mystical dire ruby wolf. Larger than its lesser counterpart, its every movement is powerful enough to cause small tremors. The choice is kind of obvious, unless you wish to become an ice wolf, Agni. Worf. Agni snorted in response, making it clear that he had no desire to take that path. To Roland, after reading through the descriptions, it was quite a strange option to come across. It was a monster variant that seemed to be the complete opposite of the solar wolf Agni was meant to become. Instead of possessing an affinity for fire and the divine power of Solaria, it was aligned with ice and the divinity of Lunaria and Lunaris. I wonder how those nutcases from the church would react. The image of Aurelia Valerian entered his mind. She was quite the zealot, and it would not be surprising if someone like her tried to put him on the chopping block for forcing a divine creature to transform into a beast associated with a rival deity. The Sun and Moon Elves had been competing for millennia. They were practically two sides of the same coin, yet they had been locked in an ideological struggle for as long as history could remember. Choosing the Wolf of Eclipse would practically be inviting a confrontation. Roland could already imagine the Moon Elves showing up to inspect a companion beast connected to their god. The last thing I need is a holy crusade in my backyard. The next two options were somewhat underwhelming. They were certainly powerful, but they lacked the unique divine aspect that Agni had already unlocked. Choosing either of them would mean abandoning all the rare traits he had worked so hard to cultivate throughout their previous adventures. There was also the Fenrir variant, which appeared to be even larger than the previous one. To Roland's knowledge, its next evolution would be a greater Fenrir, a Tier 4 creature capable of contending with dragons and growing just as large as some of them. That was not something he wanted Agni to become. A beast of that size would make dungeon diving with him practically impossible. That left the final choice, the solar wolf with the ruby form included. It was the natural progression of Agni's current path, allowing him to retain his dual form while elevating his divine status even further. It was exactly what they needed, although Roland still was not entirely sure what the outcome would be. All right, boy. Looks like we're sticking with the sun motif until we find something better. Roland reached out and patted Agni's snout. Are you ready? Agni answered with a low, resonant growl, his body tensing as he prepared himself for what would likely be a painful transformation. Don't worry, Agni. The array you're standing on has a pain-relieving function. Drink this as well. It'll numb your body, and it should make the process much easier. Roland was not about to make Agni endure a bone-breaking transformation without doing everything he could to spare him the pain. He handed him a bowl filled with a potion Rastix had prepared specifically for this occasion. Once the wolf lapped up every last drop, it was finally time to begin the evolution. The last time, Agni had refused the pain reliever, but this time he seemed to know better. Name: Sunlight Wolf Divine Form L250. Type: Fire/Earth/Divine Beast. HP: 64375/64375. MP: 58672/57621. SP: 90383/90381. Strength: 482. Agility: 646. Dexterity: 379. Vitality: 559. Endurance: 613. Intelligence: 556. Willpower: 540. Charisma: 22. Luck: 18. His level had reached the apex of 250, and he had also learned another skill upon reaching it. Holy Solar Regeneration. Passive skill. When the Sunlight Wolf's health drops below 30%, it enters a regenerative state, rapidly restoring health. While in this state, incoming magical attacks are partially converted into healing. The regeneration continues even after reaching full health for a limited time. The effect is enhanced in direct sunlight and can only trigger once per day. It was a skill that reminded him of his own overlord's indomitable will, which also triggered rapid health regeneration after suffering critical damage. There were some key differences. Agni did not gain any stat boosts or increased power, but this skill appeared to remain active for a while after it was triggered. That meant if damage kept coming his way, he would continue to heal, perhaps granting him a brief period of quasi-invincibility. Solar Wolf. I guess the skill names were foreshadowing the new class. He smiled before looking back at Agni, who was ready. The time for the transformation had finally come, so he selected the Solar Wolf option on the screen. Just like before, the change happened almost immediately. As expected, Agni's body began radiating solar energy, far more intensely than ever before. The ambient temperature inside the reinforced vault spiked instantly. The heavy alloy plating covering the walls groaned as the intense heat made the metal hiss and glow red. Roland watched from within his most heat-resistant armor and quickly activated the rune arrays he had prepared in advance. This is way more intense than the last one. Agni's body became enveloped in an almost perfect sphere of flames. It looked as though he had been swallowed by a miniature sun that expanded until it nearly touched the ceiling and the walls. At that point, the barriers sprang to life, along with the filtration system and the cooling runes Roland had installed specifically for this occasion. The superheated air was rapidly drawn away, funneled out of the chamber, and carried upward through the specialized cooling shafts carved into the surrounding rock. Deep groans reverberated through the metallic floor as Agni's body began to shift. Roland could not make out exactly what was happening, but it was obvious that a profound transformation was underway. The wolf let out a muffled whine before the sound was drowned out by the sizzling alloy, which had begun to melt despite the immense magical protection surrounding it. I'll have to reroute more power. Roland acted immediately, channeling his own mana along with the stored reserves to reinforce the defensive magic. Even though a legendary creature was being reborn before him, he still surpassed it by a few levels, and the runes he could craft were among the finest anyone at his level was capable of producing. The chamber groaned as the flames intensified, but the structure held. The sections of metal that had turned red gradually shifted back to a deep orange as Roland brought the situation under control. The miniature sun filling the chamber stopped expanding, yet it continued to release bursts of scorching heat and divine energy far more powerful than anything Agni had been capable of before. For nearly 10 minutes, the vault remained a roaring furnace of white-hot light and crackling divinity. Roland kept his eyes fixed on the diagnostic monitors and was forced to burn through a massive reserve of runic batteries just to keep everything stable. The structural integrity of the room continued to fluctuate, but eventually the mana radiation began to subside, and the golden sphere of fire before him gradually diminished. Slowly, the miniature sun collapsed inward, drawing the scattered flames back toward the center of the room like a black hole. The blinding light faded into a soothing golden radiance that washed over the chamber, and from within it, the figure of a wolf emerged. Agni stood at the center of the cratered room, transformed. His divine form was roughly the same size as before, but his frame was sleeker and far more regal. Previously, it had looked as though his body was engulfed in flames. Now, it seemed as if he was the divine flames themselves. Only his paws still appeared to be made of flesh. The most striking change was his flaming horn. It now appeared to be formed entirely from fire, its golden flames brighter and more distinct than the rest of his body. His mane had grown thicker, beginning with a radiant golden pattern near its base before gradually shifting into a blazing crimson hue toward the ends. Flickering embers drifted into the air before fading away. His paws were still gently enveloped in flames, revealing dark reddish fur that gradually gave way to living fire farther up his legs. Then his eyes opened, revealing a white-blue glow as though an even fiercer flame burned within them, the fire of a white sun. You certainly look more majestic than before. Roland checked every sensor one last time before approaching. Now that Agni's transformation was complete, the overwhelming heat had faded. Just as before, the divine flames radiated very little warmth and could even be touched by ordinary people, provided the wolf allowed it. Woo! A long howl echoed through the vault, producing a surge of divine mana that swept across the room. Roland felt a strange tingling sensation spread through his body. His stamina was instantly restored, and his mana began regenerating at a remarkable pace. Another buffing howl. As he approached Agni, Roland examined one of the new skills the wolf had acquired, the very one he had just used. Howl of the Solar Wolf. Active skill. Releases a howl of divine energy that alleviates fatigue, restores health and mana, and cleanses various adverse status effects, as well as some curses. It was somewhat similar to the previous skill, Solar Howl. However, it was more focused on sound and lacked any offensive power that could target enemies. Instead, it provided several beneficial buffs while also cleansing debuffs and certain curses. I wonder if he can use both howls at the same time. The glowing, whitish eyes that blinked open looked remarkably clear. Roland knew that yellow was not the hottest color of flame. White burned even hotter, while blue and violet marked even greater temperatures. Faint glints of blue shimmered within Agni's eyes, perhaps indicating what the future held. Woof! Agni looked down at his paws, lifting one up and down as if he were a person trying on a new pair of shoes. His form was similar to his previous one, but there were a few noticeable changes. He trotted around the chamber several times and seemed much lighter on his feet, likely because his body was now partially composed of divine energy. Tier 3, High Divine Beast. Trait. Adds a multiplier of 3.999 to all of the basic stats with the exception of luck and charisma. His evolution also brought another bonus by increasing his stat multiplier even further. While it appeared to be only a small improvement, the increase across every applicable stat made Agni significantly stronger and faster. Name. Sunlight Wolf Divine Form L250. Type. Fire/Earth/Divine Beast. HP. 72428/72428. MP. 69920/69920. SP. 99229/99229. Strength. 497 plus 15. Agility. 666 plus 20. Dexterity. 394 plus 15. Vitality. 574 plus 15. Endurance. 628 plus 15. Intelligence. 576 plus 20. Willpower. 560 plus 20. Charisma. 24 plus 2. Luck. 20 plus 2. There were also changes to some of his previous skills and abilities. Divine Element Affinity had been upgraded to High Divine Element Affinity. High Divine Element Affinity L1. Passive skill. Allows the caster to infuse spells with divine energy. Increases the probability of learning higher divine elemental spells and lowers the failure rate when casting any divine spell. The same was true for Advanced Destruction Magic related to Fire and Earth, which had evolved into High Advanced Destruction Magic. It was still within the limits of Tier 3, but its effectiveness would certainly be much greater, making more advanced spells both stronger and easier to cast. You seem happy, Agni. Woof. Agni stepped closer, and his large flaming tongue landed across Roland's face. Somehow, despite being engulfed in flames, his saliva still managed to coat Roland's visor. Let's just finish this. Try transforming into your ruby form. There was only one thing left to test, the appearance of his other form. The description for the blazing alpha mystical dire ruby wolf mentioned several things that seemed potentially problematic, but there was no way to know for certain until they tried. Awoo! The transformation began, and just as Roland had expected, the temperature inside the chamber started to rise once more. Now that's quite the sight. He really is ablaze. Roland looked at Agni through his helmet's visor. If he wasn't wearing his salamander armor, which offered the best protection against heat, he would probably be sweating by now. Before him stood a large, intimidating beast that looked like a walking volcano. The weightless divine flames of Agni's previous solar wolf form had vanished, replaced by a much heavier appearance. Thick ruby plates now covered much more of his body than before, while his paws remained perpetually engulfed in flames that made the ground beneath them sizzle from the intense heat. Just as the description had stated, the horn on his forehead was spiral-shaped and closely resembled that of a unicorn. Most of his fur had been replaced by sharp-looking red gemstones that refracted the crimson light radiating from his body. Something resembling liquid fire flowed through the cracks between the crystalline plates, glowing brightly and releasing even more heat into the surroundings. Woof! Agni barked, and the sound reverberated throughout the chamber. The intensity was nowhere near as overwhelming as when the miniature sun had appeared during his transformation, but Roland could still feel it. If left unchecked, the heat generated here would certainly affect the surrounding environment. Is there something you can do about those flames, like with your other form? He asked as he stepped closer. While his armor protected him from the heat, things would become far more complicated if Agni couldn't suppress his flames in this form. Bringing him into settlements would be impossible if wooden buildings started catching fire and innocent people were injured simply because they lacked fire resistance skills. Agni tilted his large, ruby-covered head, his glowing yellow eyes blinking as he processed the question. He let out a low huff, sending a small puff of black smoke from his nostrils before closing his eyes in concentration. The liquid fire flowing between his ruby plates began to pulse, and the brilliant crimson glow gradually darkened. The flames surrounding his paws slowly receded, shrinking considerably without ever disappearing completely. His aura flickered for a few moments as the heat steadily subsided until Roland finally felt safe enough to reach out and touch him. It's still warm, but you won't burn anyone if you suppress it this much. Can you keep it like this? Worf. Agni nodded, nearly poking Roland in the shoulder with his elongated horn, which was almost twice the length of the one from his previous form. Hey! Be careful! You're going to poke someone's eye out with that. His wolf let out a soft whine at the scolding, but he was smart enough to realize he was at fault. Maybe it would be better if you stayed here for a while and learned to control your flames. If I introduced you to Millie, there's no telling what that girl would do. Woof. Agni was clearly unhappy with that decision, but Roland wasn't comfortable letting his high tier 3 beast roam freely just yet. His level was tremendous, and he was a walking fire hazard. It was obvious that his flames were influenced by his emotions. Even now, the fire around his paws blazed more after Roland told him he would be confined to the workshop. It's just temporary, and you seem to have more control in your main form, so for now you'll have to stay in it when interacting with others. While his wolf jumped around like an eager puppy after hearing that, he examined his body more closely. His size had increased slightly, though not by much, and most of the change seemed to come from the thicker ruby plates covering his body. Then there was another personal skill that this form had received. Ruby Blaze L1. Active skill. This skill causes the user to forcefully erupt with the accumulated heat stored within the body, instantly projecting a massive wave of ruby projectiles and superheated plasma in all directions. After the skill is used, the ruby outer shell is removed, lowering defenses but increasing speed. It was quite an interesting skill. Roland noticed that Agni was much more heavily armored now, and his defenses had likely increased. However, the skill could also be used to shed that armor and transform into a more agile form. The only problem was that it seemed difficult to use effectively. Will it just spray ruby shards and fire energy in every direction, or can it be controlled? If the skill couldn't be aimed at enemies alone, then friendly fire would become a serious issue. Luckily, they had some time to perform a few tests, and everyone who could be harmed was still outside the compound. Alright, let's give your new skills a test. This chamber is already partially melted. Some of the runes had been damaged during the evolution and then repaired by Roland's skill, which had lowered their grade. It was the best place to find out whether Agni's explosive skill could be controlled. Awoo! I see you're eager too, so let's start with Ruby Blaze. Woof! Agni shifted into a stance that looked ready to activate the skill immediately, but Roland quickly waved a hand at him. Just let me get out of this room first. I'll observe you through the cameras. Do you really want to impale your master with those rubies of yours? The wolf snorted, baring his white teeth in what looked like a grin. Even though he resembled a volcanic monster on the outside, beneath the ruby armor, his body was still made of ordinary flesh. Okay, now you can do it. It took Roland a moment to open the thick doors and step outside. The cameras were protected behind glass-like casings made from the same material he had received in a trade after the incident at the Valyrian estate. Awoo! Agni immediately let out a howl as he activated his new skill, and Roland kept his eyes fixed on one of the monitors outside the chamber. The cracks between Agni's ruby plates began to glow with a blinding light. The liquid fire flowing beneath his crystalline armor surged, changing from a subdued crimson to a brilliant, scorching red. The wolf tensed his muscles, digging his massive paws into the metallic floor as the accumulated heat reached a critical point. It takes a moment to activate, but that will probably improve as the skill levels up. Roland analyzed the skill's performance, and its first weakness was immediately apparent. It took several seconds for the heat to build up, but Agni was not completely exposed during that time. A massive surge of flames engulfed his body, forming something akin to a veil of mana that appeared capable of deflecting incoming attacks. Then, as the gathered energy reached its peak, everything exploded. Ruby crystals were sent flying in all directions, striking the reinforced walls with loud metallic clangs. They embedded themselves deep into the heavy alloy plating. At the same time, a wave of superheated plasma expanded outward, instantly scorching the already battered vault and melting the surface layer of the floor into molten sludge. The heat signature on the monitors spiked to dangerous levels before the cooling shafts activated once more to vent the excess heat. Even after the thermal energy was dispersed and the walls began to cool, they remained riddled with chunks of organic ruby crystal embedded in the alloy. That's quite deadly, and the initial heat burst is stronger than during the evolution. While the miniaturized sun produced more energy over the 10 minutes it remained active, this burst of blaze energy was a far more focused attack that would probably eviscerate anyone standing close to Agni when he used the skill. However, just as Roland had expected, it was also highly indiscriminate and, if left uncontrolled, could easily injure people more than 100 meters away. A third form, hey? This one looks quite agile. After the heat subsided, another form emerged from beneath the thick layer of ruby plating. Agni resembled his previous form, with fewer rubies covering his body but far more fire surrounding it. Try running around in this form, Agni, and use some of your magic. Awoo! Agni did not hesitate. He blurred across the partially melted floor, his movements much faster than they had been moments earlier or in his previous evolutionary form. Without the heavy crystalline armor weighing him down, he moved like a streak of living red light. He zipped from one corner of the reinforced vault to the other, leaving faint trails of embers in his wake that quickly vanished into the cooling vents. His agility was always his forte, and in this form it seems to have reached a new level. Roland observed as he tracked the test. One thing quickly became apparent. After a short while, the rubies that had been blown away began to slowly grow back. After nearly 15 minutes, Agni had recovered roughly half of the lost plating, at which point another change occurred as he received a new skill. Now that's a new one. Ruby Body Control L1. Active skill. This skill regulates the size and length of the rubies that grow across the user's body. It was a skill that allowed Agni to halt the regeneration of his ruby armor or encourage it to grow even further. After several tests, it became possible to remain in either the heavily armored or the more agile ruby form by using the ruby body control skill without having to detonate the armor in a blazing explosion. It was also possible to use the ruby blaze skill while wearing less armor, though doing so drastically reduced its destructive power. That should be enough for today. If you stay like this, the others should be safe around you. Woof. Thanks to his newly gained ability to control his ruby coating, Agni was even able to dull the sharpness of the crystals, making them safe for children. The flames were also completely under his control, receding until they became nothing more than a warm layer covering his dark crimson paws. There was a downside to this ruby control skill. Once the outer layer had formed and the process stopped, it became difficult for Agni to make further alterations. There seemed to be a window of around half an hour before the rubies fully hardened and could no longer be reshaped. As a result, Agni had to completely shed the existing layer using the previous explosive skill before creating a stronger, more battle-ready suit of ruby armor. Well then, everyone should be back by now, so let's introduce you to the others. Worf. They had spent several hours inside the bunker chamber, which had now been left in ruins. As before, the horn on Agni's body could conjure a variety of spells and fire a crimson beam in the direction it was pointing. Earlier, it had drilled a massive hole straight through the metal alloy wall. As they made their way back toward the elevator, Roland reflected that it was finally time for him to push his own growth further. His levels had stopped increasing for several reasons, one of them being the amount of time he devoted to the Institute and the golem. Now that Agni had evolved, Roland planned to return to the dungeon alone to maximize his experience gain. His companion would probably dislike the idea, but he would have little room to complain. Master, is that? Yes, it is. He looks a bit different now, but this is Agni. Millie, his one and only disciple, stared at Agni's evolved form with stars in her eyes. She had always loved animals, so the transformation left her utterly astonished. The rubies covering his coat looked smoother than before, catching and refracting the sunlight with a brilliant crimson shimmer. Can I pet him? Millie asked, her hands twitching with anticipation. Whenever she was presented with an animal to pet, she became impossible to restrain. Roland simply nodded. Go ahead, but be careful around his horn and his paws. This new form is more volatile than the previous one. Roland pointed to the tiny glowing embers drifting from Agni's body. Although they resembled small flames, they were magical in nature and could be controlled so they would not burn the skin. So be careful when you touch those areas. Before Roland could finish his warning, Millie had already lunged forward, burying her face deep into the thick, crimson-tipped mane around Agni's neck. The wolf let out a contented huff, his massive tail thumping against the ground outside with enough force to send faint vibrations through the floor. He seemed completely delighted by the attention, tilting his head to give her easier access to his favorite scratching spots behind his ears. Even with her face buried in his ruby-covered mane, Millie knew better than to press in too hard, so she escaped without a scratch. Still, Agni's transformation had made him much harder to pet, and it took considerably more force for him to feel the scratches, even behind his ears. This might be a good opportunity. Millie, could you step away for a moment? Ah, do I have to? Look, his leg is about to give in. She pointed at Agni's hind leg, which had already begun twitching as she rubbed his belly. Roland merely tilted his head, and Millie finally relented. Fine then, master. She looked disappointed at first, but after Roland revealed what he had in mind, her excitement returned almost instantly. Transform into your other form, Agni. Awoo. The howl began as a deep, powerful cry, but as flames blossomed around him, the sound became strangely melodic. His ruby form was engulfed in orange fire, which quickly settled into a mantle of shimmering golden embers. Oh, something is happening, master. Millie watched, captivated by the transformation that soon filled the compound with a warm, gentle light. The flame energies were overwhelmed by divine power, and instead of a wave of scorching heat, a soothing breeze swept across the yard. The heavy ruby plates dissolved into the soft, shimmering golden flame coat of the solar wolf's divine form. The intimidating crystalline structure vanished completely, replaced by a radiant, majestic grace that seemed to banish fatigue from the surrounding area. Millie let out a soft gasp, her eyes widening to the size of saucers. It was not only the breathtaking sight that left her spellbound. The soothing aura washing over her was just as remarkable. Every ache in her body, along with all her stress and discomfort, vanished almost instantly. He's so majestic, but also soft and fluffy looking. See, can I pet him? Sure. The flames won't burn you. Just don't overdo it. I'm not sure what will happen if you pet him too hard. Roland replied as he watched his eager disciple approach with slow, careful steps. This time was different. Instead of rushing forward, she seemed almost afraid to touch him, not because she feared hurting him, but because she worried he might disappear like a ghost the moment she made contact. Woof! Agni, this flame fur. It's so soft, softer than any material I've ever touched before. Millie buried her hands in the divine, almost weightless fur. The golden embers parted around her fingers like warm liquid, radiating a comforting heat. Agni leaned into her touch, his tongue lolling from his mouth in pure bliss. You're such a good boy. She pressed her face against the wolf as she hugged him. Without the ruby plates covering him, he looked both safe and irresistibly comfortable. A noble beast, hey! Roland watched as the so-called noble solar wolf rolled onto his back and began behaving like an overgrown puppy. One of his hind legs started kicking furiously after Millie found just the right spot, and his tail thumped happily against the ground. I wonder what those priests would say if they saw their holy beast like this. That was one of the biggest issues on Roland's mind. The sunlight wolf was gone, replaced by this new solar wolf. The evolution description still identified him as a companion animal, so Roland assumed little would change, but now that Agni had reached this stage, he could easily attract the church's attention. It would be wise to hide this for now. Agni had advanced to a much higher level in a remarkably short time. No one besides the people Roland trusted knew about his evolution, and Millie did not understand the church well enough to recognize the potential complications. For most people, this would become a serious problem, but Roland already had a possible solution. With the research I conducted on illusion magic at the Academy, I should be able to fool anyone below Tier 4. It should not be too difficult. If Agni wore specially crafted armor or a rune-inscribed harness, Roland could easily explain away any oddities. The disguise would conceal his current appearance and present him as the lesser-evolved Sunlight Wolf. It would buy Roland time to consider his next move and hopefully keep the zealots from asking too many questions. Such a good boy. Yes, you are. Roland's thoughts were interrupted by another round of enthusiastic tail thumping. I think he's had enough, Millie. If you keep going, you'll spoil him. Ah! She pouted but did not argue. Instead, she planted a big smooch on Agni's nose before reluctantly stepping away. Now, I need your help with a few things while you're here. Of course, master. She sprang to her feet with renewed enthusiasm, and soon the trio headed deeper into the workshop to tackle several projects at once. Goa! A massive skeletal monster charged at a lone man wearing a mismatched set of armor. Some pieces were made of a metal that resembled gold, while the rest were pitch black. Just be quiet. I was enjoying the moment of silence. The monster rushed forward, but before it could do anything, a field of gravity expanded around it and slammed it into the ground. The stone cracked beneath it as the localized spell dramatically increased its weight. Pinned down and only able to crawl forward, it was met by a beam of golden light. Roland's golden gauntlets shone brightly, their runes bursting with energy as the radiant beam surged ahead. It engulfed the creature of bone and rotting flesh. In an instant, the foul air cleared as divine energy spread through the corridor. The skeletal remains crumbled into fine grey ash and scattered across the damp stone floor of the dungeon. Roland lowered his golden gauntlet. The warmth it had radiated quickly faded as the emulated divine mana dissipated. The damage output against undead has increased by around 15%. Roland glanced at his golden gauntlet and the runes that still glowed across its surface. He was reviewing the latest adjustments he had made after Agni's evolution. A solar wolf's mana was different from that of a sunlight wolf. All of the divine spells he could reproduce were based either on spells from the Church of Solaria that he had copied by observing priests and paladins, or on his analysis of Agni's abilities. The wolf possessed a much purer mana signature than any priest he had encountered. It was only natural that after reaching a higher evolutionary form, adjusting the emulated mana would increase the power of those spells. It'll be easier to farm this place now, but even if I clear it out every time the monsters respawn, it still probably won't be enough. He checked his current level along with the experience he earned from clearing the entire ruin by himself. This had been the last monster on the route, and it would take another 2 days for them to respawn. There was no real way to speed up the process. The dungeon could not restore its monsters any faster, and hunting above ground was even less efficient because the monsters were spread too far apart. Even if I hunt those sea serpents, the amount of experience I'll gain will be minimal. There was not much he could do about the situation. He also did not have the free time to spend every day running through the dungeon. The golem still needed to be finished, the students required more guidance, and there were countless support items that still needed to be reviewed and tested. Even though Arian was the de facto leader of the runic department, he constantly asked Roland for advice on nearly every decision he made. Even in his own area of expertise, runic operating systems, Roland still had to review almost everything before it was finalized and approved for production. He sighed and shook his head as he began walking back toward the teleportation gate. The gate he had installed earlier closed behind him just as several spider golems skittered past. They continued gathering anything valuable after each successful hunt, and he was quickly amassing a small fortune in undead materials, all of which Rastix could put to good use. The bone dust that came from the undead lesser dragons was usually useless without proper treatment. The church normally handled the purification process, removing the necrotic energy clinging to it. Once purified, the bone meal made from it became a powerful fertilizer for a wide variety of Tier 3 herbs and plants. Thanks to his mastery of divine energy manipulation through runes, Roland could purify the bones the moment they crumbled into ash. The bone dust still required a short refining process, but the difficult task of removing the undead energy had already been completed at no cost. He had been storing drums filled with purified bone ash from these monsters for quite some time, until Rastix gave him an idea. "Wayland! Look at how much it's all grown. If those idiots from the Alchemy Guild could see this, they'd die of envy." "Ha, sure they would." Roland had traveled through the gate and stopped by to deliver another shipment of bone dust to Rastix. They were now standing in the gnome's laboratory, specifically in a section filled with brilliant lights and oversized pots. From the soil enriched with bone meal harvested from the undead lesser dragons, colorful sprouts were already pushing through the dark earth. Nothing beats your own plant cultivation chamber. Those fools would all be green with envy if they saw this. Not even that old fart of a headmaster had a place like this. The gnome alchemist rubbed his hands together with a greedy grin plastered across his face. He was practically drooling over the glowing blue leaves of a frost lotus that had begun to sprout in the corner of the room. It was a rare Tier 3 herb that normally took years to mature in the wild, yet here it was, already showing remarkable growth after only a few weeks of being fed purified bone meal. The bone meal certainly helped, but there was far more to it. The entire room functioned as a massive greenhouse equipped with magical runic lamps calibrated for each individual plant. Some herbs required bright sunlight, others thrived in deep shade, while certain species needed to be bathed in mana of a precise wavelength. It was the kind of facility no ordinary alchemist could ever hope to build, but with Roland's expertise, it had become a reality. The mana density in this batch is incredible. The potions brewed from these might even be twice as effective. Rastix was completely absorbed in his own world. The only thing on his mind was proving the alchemy guild wrong and demonstrating that he was superior to the people who had cast him out. Although he was a genius when it came to alchemy, he had several flaws. The biggest was that he cared little for his own safety or anyone else's whenever he was experimenting. Sure, but what about that other project? How's it going? The other project? Oh, you mean that? The gnome stroked his beard for a moment before smiling. It has been a success. Let me show you. Rastix scurried over to a heavily reinforced safe embedded in the wall. He placed his hand on a nearby runic panel, which immediately began to glow. The device scanned his handprint, mana signature, and several other identifying markers. A moment later, the heavy door hissed open, releasing a small cloud of chilled vapor. When you told me about it, I could hardly believe it was possible, but here it is, my very own personalized holy elixir. The gnome carefully retrieved a spherical glass vial. Inside, a viscous golden liquid swirled lazily, completely independent of the vial's movement. It looked like liquid sunlight and radiated a comforting warmth. Behold! A Tier 3 elixir. Roland nodded as he examined the concentrated healing reagent. It was something that normally could not be created without the aid of a priest or materials specially prepared by one. Such concoctions were heavily restricted by the churches and were one of their greatest sources of income. As you know, if word of this gets out. I know. Don't worry. Even I'm not crazy enough to go against the Inquisition. My lips are sealed. But could you tell me how those divine relics actually work? It's better if you don't know. Rastix frowned slightly when Roland refused to reveal how he emulated holy mana. As far as the gnome knew, they were using an ancient church relic capable of infusing plants and potions with divine energy, much like a priest. Agni's presence also provided a convenient explanation for how the relic could be fully recharged each time. No one needed to know the truth, that it was Roland and his runes that could replicate divine mana. The elixirs Rastix produced were even superior to those sold by the church, and Roland intended to keep a healthy supply around his compound. While they could not regenerate completely severed limbs, they could preserve enough vitality to reattach one and heal even the most critical injuries. It's just a shame we can't sell them. It's better if we don't. And don't even think about putting any on the black market. Who do you think I am? A mad alchemist. Haha, that's true. But don't worry. I'll never work with those crooks. I already have everything I need right here. Roland nodded again. He had decided to place a little more trust in Rastix, as the gnome was not the type to carelessly reveal his secrets. Even so, he had made him sign several contracts and prepared a convincing explanation for their use of divine energy in case anyone became suspicious. Selling the elixirs on the black market was tempting, but there was always the risk of being discovered. Divine mana left traces in the world that could be tracked unless they were properly concealed. There was always a slight chance someone could follow those traces back to them. Still, since Roland regularly purchased elixirs from the church, no one was likely to suspect him of producing illegal divine elixirs. The profits would certainly be worthwhile. Because the churches tightly controlled divine elixirs, people operating in the underworld were often willing to pay twice the usual price to avoid dealing with them. The required materials were not particularly expensive either, so if he ever needed a large amount of gold in a hurry, it remained a viable option. Now then, if we're done here. If you have any requests, send them through the usual channels. Of course. This time, Rastix nodded and quickly turned away. His mind was already running through alchemical formulas he wanted to test in a new batch of potions. Even though many recipes in this world were considered set in stone, there were still those who conducted experiments in hopes of creating more potent concoctions or discovering entirely new effects. Let's check on our mother hen next. With his next destination in mind, Roland took one of the underground tunnels to a hidden chamber that housed one of his most important possessions, the dragon egg. So, how is your baby faring? Woof. Agni let out an annoyed huff, a puff of smoke escaping from his nostrils. After his evolution, he had been assigned to watch the dragon egg, which had developed the habit of slowly absorbing his mana. Don't be like that. You won't have to stay in here anymore. The egg had proven to be surprisingly finicky. Roland had expected Agni's pure mana to speed up the hatching process, but instead, it had slowed almost to a crawl at first. It was as though he had changed the recipe too much, and the egg had become a picky eater. Only after Agni spent half of each day in the chamber did it begin absorbing the solar wolf's mana at its previous rate again. The egg itself had also undergone a subtle transformation. It had once appeared dull and ominous, an impression largely caused by the corrupt energies it had absorbed while resting in the dungeon. After several months of feeding on Agni's mana, its shell had developed a faint sheen. Dark patches still lingered across its surface, however, leaving Roland to wonder what kind of creature would eventually emerge. The absorption rate has stabilized, and I've stored enough of your mana to sustain this egg for at least half a year, so you're free to go outside. Just don't forget to wear your new harness. Woof! Agni wasted no time bounding through the doorway. He was now required to wear a harness that projected an illusion, making him appear as his former sunlight wolf self. There's definitely something inside, and it's growing. Roland lingered beside the egg for a moment to examine it once more. Although it appeared unchanged on the surface, there were subtle signs of development beneath the shell. The egg had grown heavier over time, suggesting that the embryo inside was steadily maturing. If all went well, it might finally hatch within a few months. With that task finished, Roland prepared to return to his workshop and continue work on the large-scale golem. Before he could leave, however, a communication request appeared. Yes. Knight Commander, the surgery has been successful. We are ready to proceed with the life test. Ah. I'll be right there. The image of a woman in a maid's uniform flickered before disappearing as the transmission ended. Amid everything else demanding his attention, Roland had almost forgotten that he was close to solving an older problem, one involving House Valerian and his friend Arthur. No rest for the wicked. With a weary sigh, he slumped his shoulders and headed back through the corridors of his workshop toward the underground facility beneath Arthur's estate. Sir. Give me a report. How is the subject behaving? The monster seems to be fine. Its condition has stabilized, and no signs of rejection of the device have been detected. A maid wearing glasses and holding a clipboard spoke to him as they looked into a chamber through a thick sheet of glass. The creature inside could not see them, but they could clearly watch it moving around. Looks promising. Release the leg restraints. Let's see if it can actually see. Inside the chamber was a simple, ordinary hobgoblin. It was strapped to a metal chair in the middle of an otherwise empty room. Fixed over its face was a metallic device resembling a blindfold, permanently attached to replace its eyes. Once the restraints were released, the monster looked disoriented. It reached up and touched its face and the runic device that had been placed there, but it did not remove it. It tried pulling at it and pushing it down, yet the device refused to budge. Set into the center of the metal was a deeply embedded sphere that shifted with the creature's head movements, tracking wherever it looked. It seems to be receiving visual input, but it might damage the device if this continues. I understand, sir. The maid nodded and, without needing further instruction, pressed a button on a nearby console. A jolt of electricity surged through the device, shocking the hobgoblin. It let out a shriek, its limbs twitching as it pulled its green fingers away from its head. The monster tried again, but after another shock, it quickly learned that touching the device was a bad idea. Good. It seems stable. Roland watched the creature move around the chamber. It was not stumbling over its own feet and effortlessly avoided the few obstacles that had been placed in its path. It was clear to him that it could see everything in front of it. It's a success. With this, the Lord's mother will finally be able to. Several other people stood in the observation room with him. Some were maids from the estate, while the rest were members of the research team working under him. This was the final test before Roland felt confident enough to begin trials on humans and the other races. The device attached to the monster's head could replace its eyes, a breakthrough far more significant than anyone in the room realized. The immediate goal was to restore Illyria's sight, but the implications of this research reached much further. It proved that long-lost senses could now be restored. Sight was only the beginning. Even sensation in paralyzed or damaged limbs might one day be recovered without relying on Tier 4 healing spells. How far can this technology go? While the others celebrated and congratulated one another, Roland's thoughts drifted to the future. Tier 4 healing spells were incredibly powerful, but they still had their limits. He had stepped into the field of prosthetic replacement. He could now restore sight without reconnecting damaged optic nerves. Although the hobgoblin appeared to be wearing an artificial eye that fit into its sockets, that was not how the device actually worked. Everything functioned through the mana phantom and its connection to the soul, allowing a lost sense to be restored without repairing the original organ. For now, the single golemic eye embedded in the center of the device served as the subject's new source of vision, though it could eventually be replaced with a far less conspicuous design. The only thing left was to obtain permission from Arthur's father to examine his mother. Without studying Illyria's mana pattern and tailoring the device specifically to her, restoring her sight would be impossible. I see, so it's finished. In theory, yes, but without being able to make the proper adjustments, it will be impossible to finish. Roland stood before Arthur, the Lord of Albrook and son of the Duke. In his hands was a sketch of the accessory he planned to place on Arthur's mother, one that would allow her to see again without the help of Tier 4 or 5 magic. My father is not going to like this. Arthur muttered, leaning back in his leather chair. He is already wary of anyone coming into the castle, and even I can't visit mother more than twice a year now. This was the main problem. Arthur's mother was kept like a bird in a cage. To some, it seemed the Duke was being unreasonable, but Roland could see the logic behind it. Protecting Illyria was far easier within the safety of that stronghold. Someone wanted her dead, so the cage she found herself in was, to some, a necessary precaution. Until the person behind the assassination attempt was identified, letting her roam freely would be unwise, and Arthur understood that as well. If only we knew who was behind this. There are many possibilities. Your father's wives are all potential suspects, but without solid evidence, pointing fingers is a death sentence. Arthur sighed deeply, the weight of his noble lineage visibly pressing on his shoulders. He stared at the sketch on his desk, his eyes tracing the delicate runic patterns Roland had drawn. I know. Arthur's voice was barely above a whisper. My half-brothers are possible suspects as well. There is no one in that house I can truly trust. Roland watched Arthur's expression tighten. His noble friend was usually good at hiding his emotions and playing the role of a composed lord, but whenever the subject of his mother came up, his anger always found a way to show itself. Has Mary been able to gather any more information? Roland asked, glancing down at the drawing he had presented. It depicted an elegant accessory that could be worn over the face while still looking stylish enough for a noble lady. Nothing much. This assassination group seems to be very well connected, and none of the information brokers are even willing to investigate them. He nodded. It made sense. An organization willing to carry out murder contracts in a duke's backyard must have powerful backing. Regretfully, yes. We still managed to gather some information thanks to your efforts, but Mary is still looking into it. You have my gratitude, as always. For now, however, I need some time to think. The assassin he had captured had been through a great deal, and while they had managed to extract some useful information from him, much of it led to dead ends. The organization they were up against was exceptionally skilled at covering its tracks and avoiding exposure. Still, from what he had heard, there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm just doing my job. You should stop being so modest. Arthur laughed, and for a brief moment, some warmth returned to his face. Modest? Wait until you see next month's bill. Roland, in turn, took a jab at the finances, referring to how most of the city's revenue was funneled back into runic research and the continued expansion of its runic infrastructure. You might be the most expensive runic craftsman in the entire kingdom, but you always deliver results, so it's hard to complain. Arthur shrugged with a chuckle, and soon the two parted ways. There was not much new within their territory. Theodore was scheming as always, but with the underground train becoming fully operational, the situation with the merchants had been resolved. Even after the fake bandit groups stopped appearing, the train remained the best method of transportation. They just need to clear out those tunnels, and the subway system under this island can finally begin. Roland thought to himself as he left Arthur's office. The project he had started with Halbrecht was still ongoing. He was not thrilled about meeting the man again, but they had been exchanging correspondence through the runic mailing system he had established. It was much faster than the spellbirds used to carry letters, and at this stage of development, it was far safer since the technology was still unknown to the public. Now then, what's next? He mumbled to himself as he descended into the underground tunnels. The golem was almost finished and nearly ready for proper field testing. Its size was somewhat of a problem, as it stood close to 10 meters tall. Luckily, if laid flat on the ground, it could still fit through the city's main portal gate. The dimensions had been chosen specifically so it could fit through the standard gates, based on what he knew. In the past, when the convocation was still in its early years, each academy transported its golems separately, which caused all kinds of problems. Some smiths transported the individual parts by other means and assembled the construct at the event. Others simply had their golems walk the entire distance, and many never arrived. There were countless reasons for the failures. Monster attacks, bandits, and even rival academies sabotaging the route by destroying the only bridge leading to the venue. Eventually, when portal technology became more widely available, the organizers decided to use it to transport the constructs instead, making the competition fair for everyone. I haven't checked up on those guys for a while. I wonder how they're doing. Roland had devoted most of his time to leveling and golem production. Now that the project was almost complete, he finally had the chance to visit the students who had been using the support devices he had created. By this point, every student taking part in the competition had received the base model, but he had not really had the time to see how the other teachers and professors had implemented his teaching methods. "Welcome, Deputy Professor." He nodded to the mage responsible for the teleportation gate and made his way forward. Around 2 months remained until the competition, and the academy was once again filled with students. Everyone who had left for vacation had returned, and the new academic year had begun. Each time I return here, their reactions to me become stranger. At first, all he saw was fear in their eyes. Whenever he walked by, they parted before him, pressing themselves against the walls or turning their heads away. Now, however, they could not stop staring or pointing at him. "It's the Deputy Professor." "Hey, Deputy Professor. Can I be your disciple?" "No, I want to be his disciple." His infamy had transformed into outright fame. He had a suspicion of why. The students under his direct supervision had undergone a drastic change. He even managed to change that Elian. He almost flinched when he heard Elian's name. Before assembling the team, he had no idea the young man had become so infamous. His magical aptitude had always been exceptional, but his nerves often got the better of him, causing him to fumble at the worst possible moments. That habit had apparently led to more than a few self-inflicted injuries while learning new spells and, on occasion, had nearly dragged other people into the accidents as well. Had he really improved that much? Roland could not judge the extent of Elian's progress. He only monitored the training chamber the boy occasionally used and watched recordings of the team's practice sessions while working his way through the underground dungeon. Perhaps his standards for teenagers were simply too high, because rumors of their rapid improvement seemed to be everywhere. Am I being too harsh on them? Once again, he questioned whether his training methods were too draconian. At their age, he had already been running his own shop in Albrook, though he had the advantage of possessing the mind of an adult from another world. He was not entirely sure what should be expected of ordinary teenagers, but judging by the results, the training he had designed was paying off. "Ah, Professor Wayland, just look." The moment he arrived, Arian greeted him enthusiastically and pointed a paw toward one of the monitors. Roland looked over and saw Elian practicing his spell casting. The boy was performing far better than before. He was not the only one, either. The number of monitors had doubled since Roland's last visit, and each displayed young mages hard at work. It was not only the group Roland and his sister personally trained. There were younger students and older ones as well. All of them were dodging magical paralysis bolts while maintaining their concentration and casting spells. "You've made more." "Indeed." The vice-headmaster approved the construction of additional chambers, and we even incorporated them into this year's curriculum. The results speak for themselves. Arian beamed with pride as he pointed to another monitor displaying a spreadsheet. It compared the casting times of students who trained in the new chambers with those who followed the traditional methods. Those using the new devices had not only improved their spell casting speed but had also significantly reduced the time needed to prepare their spells. Even the Tier 1 students were achieving results that were normally not seen until after obtaining a Tier 2 class. They had not reached that level yet, but they were steadily closing the gap, much like Roland had once done by creating Tier 2 runes despite only possessing a Tier 1 class. Though there is a small problem now. Oh? There is. Indeed. The energy required to maintain the illusion chambers is staggering. There is not enough capacity for every student, so a waiting line has formed. That is a problem. You could restrict access through a merit system, but that would hurt the students at the bottom the most. Roland muttered the thought to himself, though everyone nearby heard him and gave him puzzled looks. He knew exactly why. He came from a more modern world, one where people were not simply left behind if they fell behind the others. At the very least, everyone was usually given an equal opportunity to prove themselves. That way of thinking was still uncommon in this world. It was considered perfectly normal for wealthy or exceptionally talented students to monopolize the training chambers. To Roland, That approach made little sense, especially for an academy that competed with others. The more the school invested in its students as a whole, the greater its prestige would become, making it far more attractive to high-profile nobles choosing between rival academies. We could, but as you say, Professor, that would make it less fair for everyone. But what should we do then? There is no way to increase the academy's mana output. We would need to find another relic or build more towers. Arian did not know what to do, but to Roland, the answer was quite simple. Why does it need to be in an illusory chamber in the first place? Oh, you're right. Sometimes it felt like some people were too focused on what was directly in front of them to notice the obvious solutions. In the first place, he had used the illusory chamber because it was the fastest way to achieve the results he wanted. Nothing was stopping them from recreating those training chambers through conventional means and runic magic. Here. This is. Arian's cat-like eyes went wide with shock as he looked over the detailed schematics of various training rooms. Roland had recreated every variation he had used to help the students train with runic devices, designing each one to be as inexpensive as possible. While hunting in the dungeon, he had plenty of time between monster fights, so coming up with this solution had been fairly trivial. By the old magic gods, this is wonderful. If we build these, the cost of maintaining them would be much lower, and we are already using the golemic puppets, so that is not even an added expense. I need to go to the vice-headmaster. Arian floated out of the room while the other teachers continued applauding just as they had before. Roland had already grown accustomed to this level of flattery, though that did not mean he appreciated it. At least it made it easier to hand off much of his work to the eager teachers, with the most enthusiastic of them all being the stuttering Stephen. Deputy Professor. Stephen, these are. As he had many times before, the man brought over a massive stack of papers, though this time they were organized into several thick binders. I have calculated all the improvements in the students' performance, their casting speed, mana efficiency, and their response times to unexpected stimuli. Stephen stammered, pushing his thick glasses up his nose as he struggled to balance the heavy stack. Didn't I tell you to just input all of this into the runic operating system instead? Roland asked, as he much preferred reviewing the data through the runic system instead of sorting through stacks of paper. To his surprise, the assistant teacher already had an answer prepared. Don't worry, sir. I already input everything just the way you like it. I see, so you did both. Stephen, I really appreciate your hard work, but you should take better care of yourself and stop drinking those stamina potions. Roland could see the dark circles beneath the young man's eyes. While they could be treated with healing elixirs, there was a limit to how much strain the body could endure. Even though the young man was doing excellent work, Roland did not want him to shorten his lifespan by overworking himself. I wonder, is this how people see me whenever I work too much? The image of his worried wife came to mind, along with his assistant. Whenever he worked through the night or for days on end, they would give him disapproving looks, but they knew they could not really change his mind, so eventually they stopped trying. The only exception was his wife Lydia, who would sometimes drag him out of the workshop by force whenever he stayed there for too long. I am fine, really. This is all to gain more knowledge. Sure, you can gain more knowledge tomorrow. Go eat something and get some sleep. Until then, your research privileges are revoked. It seemed that he needed to put his foot down on this issue. This man was not a Tier 3 class holder, and his body was nowhere near as resilient as Roland's. Roland himself could more or less go without sleep for close to a week by now. And no. Anything but that. He had expected some resistance, but before he could shake his head and refuse again, the man dropped to all fours and started begging as though Roland were some villain trying to steal his child. Please, Deputy Professor, do not take away my rune terminal access. Anything but that. Surprisingly, Stephen was no longer stuttering while pleading to keep his research privileges, but Roland could not relent now. The other teachers were watching him, and if he showed that he could be swayed by emotion, they would surely exploit it in the future. Before long, he would have crowds of teachers clinging to his legs in the hallways, begging for more research funding. My decision is final. You can either take a break now and return tomorrow morning, or have your access revoked for another 3 days. The choice is yours. But, just some more research, a few more hours. No. And if you keep arguing, I'll revoke your access for a whole week. Stephen let out a quiet, defeated whine, his shoulders slumping as he slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to exile, but beneath Roland's unyielding, glowing visor, he finally nodded, grabbed his coat, and shuffled out of the research room. The remaining teachers watched the exchange with a mixture of awe and terror. Roland ignored their stares and turned his attention to the monitors near the main desk. There he found the 5 students he cared about most, the party that included his sister. They really have improved. If this keeps up, victory shouldn't be difficult. He smiled beneath his helmet as he watched Lucienne move through the illusory landscape. She darted around with far more confidence than before, using spells to enhance her physical abilities. With the support device, the process was both simple and effective. She could now keep track of the enemies thanks to her improved clairvoyant abilities, while the other students protected her well. With each passing day, they looked more and more like a proper adventuring party, though there was still room for improvement. Good. Everything is progressing well. Now I just need to help them level up before the event starts, and we should be ready to go. Roland stepped away from the screens. He had already planned a short training expedition for all the participants. They would spend a few days fighting real monsters, and once that was over, they would be more or less ready for the convocation.